Welcome. The science of gnosis is directly concerned with the development of our own inner self. The concept of self is much debated among religions and theologians and philosophers. Gnosis itself is not concerned with debate, is not interested in debate, but rather with practical experience, with direct knowledge. The student who enters these studies will encounter a concept of self, a theory of self, which encompasses theories which on the surface can appear contradictory. In varying world religions, we discover varying concepts of the nature of self, the nature of the mind. In some schools, it's posited that there is no self. In others, that the self is the soul. Or in some, that the self is Atman. In some, the self is seen as unchanging, permanent. And in some, that the self doesn't even exist. By means of this science of gnosis, the student seeks to experience the true nature of the mind. Or in other words, the true nature of the self. We begin with our own immediate, direct perception of that which we call self, or I. The most fundamental practice that the student is taught in this tradition is called self-observation. And of course, you know that self-observation is mirrored in many other traditions and called watchfulness, awareness, mindfulness. For the student to comprehend the nature of self, self-observation is a necessity. You can only understand something when you can experience it, when you can see it. So to self-observe is to watchfully, attentively analyze, to remain aware, to remain watchful. The beginning student, and even those who have been studying this science for some period of time, discover that there are enormous obstacles which obstruct the development of self-observation. Normally, the student seeks blame for these obstacles outside of oneself. Life is too hard. My job is too demanding. My teacher is not good enough. I don't have a school. I don't have books. I don't have an opportunity. I don't have the strength. These are all excuses, justifications, or in other words, what we call the rhetoric of the ego. To observe the self merely requires the ability to pay attention. And all of us have that. The difficulty is that our attention is untrained. When we analyze today, our experience of this day, we can discover the root causes of our difficulties. To observe oneself now, in this moment, requires conscious will. And conscious will is not only the foundation of Gnostic practice, it is the goal. Conscious will means to have the intention, the motivation, the action under the guidance of the consciousness. You can also say under the guidance of the conscience. So look at yourself. As you receive the impressions of life in this moment, what is unfolding within your own mind? As the sound of my voice is translated by your senses and is interpreted by your understanding, what is the result? What is promoted? What is stimulated in your own mind stream? Do you notice associative thought? Mechanical associations. If I begin to talk about school, does your mind begin to mechanically associate my words with a memory of a school that you've attended? And is that memory carrying within itself certain kinds of thoughts, certain kinds of feelings, and certain kinds of impulses? Notice how in the discussion of school, in the recollection, in the stimulation of the mind related to this concept or idea of school, how that impression produces a vibration which extends throughout your psyche. Not only as that sensation of sound, but as a stimulant for ideas, for memories, as a stimulant for feelings, and even as a stimulant for physical sensations. If we begin to discuss a painful memory, a whole new set of impressions emerge from the mind itself. Typically, we talk about impressions as coming from the outside in. But memories, ideas, and feelings which emerge from within the mind also produce impressions, which produce results. This watchfulness of your own mind is in itself the science of gnosis. The Gnostic student is seeking to perfect self-awareness, self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is born from self-observation and self-remembering. What happens when you watch television? When you sit down on your chair or couch or bed and you begin to watch the television, do you know what happens? Are you aware of the transformation that occurs in your psyche? Do you realize that you become fascinated? Fascination is a state within which we forget ourselves. And this is easily seen in how we watch movies and television. When we watch a movie or a television show, the impressions which are coming in to our sensory organs produce a state of consciousness, stimulate a state of consciousness within which we forget ourselves. We become identified with the story, with the images, with the sensations that arise. Identification is a form of sleep. In a previous lecture, we were discussing the 4 states of consciousness. The first 2, ekasya and pistis, are states of sleep. In one, the physical body is asleep and inactive, while our consciousness escapes and dreams. And in the second, our physical body is active, but yet our consciousness still dreams. When we watch television or a movie, we forget about ourselves. We forget how we're sitting. We forget our environment. We forget our own inner God. And we become so engrossed in whatever images we are observing, or whatever story we're following, that we begin to feel what the characters feel. We begin to worry about what the characters are worried about. We begin to desire what the characters desire. This is a state of psychological sleep. Profound unconsciousness. This is a state of consciousness which produces suffering. It is a form of dreaming. Unfortunately, humanity has become deeply habituated to this form of behavior. In fact, we can say humanity is addicted to the sensation of psychological sleep, to becoming absorbed in dreams, in fantasies. The addiction stems from our own misunderstanding and misconception about life and about the self. The addiction is rooted in desire. The result is that we remain asleep and we remain producing the causes of suffering for ourselves and for others. In common life, in daily life, this level of conscious sleep persists, but it's a little more subtle. Rather than being identified with that screen, we are identified instead with what's being projected by our own mind. In the case of a television screen or a movie, that projection is being produced by an external element. But as we move away from the TV or the movie, we begin to go through our daily lives, the projected imagery continues, but within. And the projectionist is our own mind, projecting the images of the subconsciousness, unconsciousness, and infraconsciousness, which persists in hypnotizing our essence or our free consciousness. In Buddhism, we talk a lot about the essence. We say essence in the sense that this is an element which is not fully developed. Another term you could use would be embryo, or seed, or germ. It is a latent potentiality. In Buddhism, there are a variety of terms for this same element. In some schools, you hear about the Buddhata. And this word really is derived from a longer term, which is Buddha Dhatu. Which is a clearer relationship to essence. Buddha Dhatu means the essence of the Buddha. Or the embryo, the seed. In certain other schools, Mahayana schools particularly, you'll hear about the Tathagata Garbha, or Tathagata Dhatu. And the Tathagata Garbha also has a similar meaning. Garbha meaning seed or essence. There's also a certain implication of the term matrix here, meaning a web of interconnectivity. But these terms all point towards the same element. Now, some now misinterpret and misunderstand Buddhism as saying that there is no self. This is not actually what the Buddha taught. The Buddha Shakyamuni taught that we all have Buddha nature, which is this same essence. Buddha Dhatu means Buddha nature. The embryo of the Buddha, the seed, the essence, the root cause of Buddhahood. And what the Buddha Shakyamuni taught was that all sentient creatures have within the potential to become a Buddha. Or in other words, an awakened or enlightened being, fully developed. But that seed, that Buddha nature, is obscured. The Maitreya Buddha gave a beautiful teaching about the Buddha nature, which is in a scripture called the Uttara Tantra Shastra, Mahayana Uttara Tantra Shastra, which basically is about Buddha nature. And in this scripture, Maitreya used analogies to indicate the nature of the Buddhata, or the essence. One of those is that he presents the example. Imagine a poor man who lives in a hut, a very poor house. Now, this man would have no idea of what's buried underneath his house because he's not able to see through the earth. But a Buddha could see that. And a Buddha would know that buried underneath the man's house is a valuable treasure. But this man, who only trusts his physical senses, has no idea. So he lives in poverty, in suffering. Now, of course, the role of that Buddha, that God, is to teach that man to look within his own house, to dig into the earth, to uncover that treasure. Of course, the treasure is the Buddha nature, which is obscured, which is buried. In another example, the Maitreya explains that the Buddha nature is like a piece of gold, but is wrapped in filthy, foul-smelling rags in a pile of garbage. And a passerby would have no idea that that hunk of gold is within that pile of garbage. But a Buddha would know that. And a Buddha would teach to that passerby to dig in the trash, to get their hands dirty, to find the gold. The action of digging into the earth, of sifting through the garbage, is self-observation, meditation, self-analysis. The filth is our own mind. The filth is our own afflictive emotions. The earth is our own selves, our own body, our own four bodies of sin, in other words, the ego. The Maitreya also says, in the same scripture, that you can search throughout the entire universe looking for the nature of your own mind, for the nature of your own self. And you will never find it. And this is because the nature of the Buddha within is within. And that Buddha nature is only realized and discovered through introspection, through inner vision, through self-observation. What does this have to do with Gemini? The astrological sign of Gemini illustrates a function of duality. When you observe the symbol of Gemini, you see two columns, or two rods, placed side by side. And of course, this symbolizes two brothers, or twins, who work together. And this illustrates a fundamental axis of nature. Among the Greeks, they are illustrated in the mythological story of Castor and Pollux, which were two brothers. Their story, which is quite involved and detailed, essentially depicts these two brothers passing through varying types of experiences. But what's most notable is that one will die and the other will live. And they have to work together in order to sustain their mutual existence. This story allegorizes how energies in nature function. We have in nature matter and energy. Matter becomes energy, and energy becomes matter. This is important. The consciousness that we have is energy. The longing to understand that energy, to understand God, to understand the consciousness, is an energy. But that energy has entered into matter, which is our own physical body. Castor and Pollux symbolize and represent that transformation of energy into matter and matter into energy. They also symbolize other aspects of nature, like evolution and involution. The way energies ascend and descend, or evolve and devolve. They symbolize birth and death. Two aspects of the same function. And all of these forces, all of these laws which manage nature, affect the development of our consciousness. The stellar influence of Gemini is the influence of a given intelligence which provides to us a kind of energy which we can use either to develop ourselves or to degenerate ourselves. The Buddha nature comes to know itself when it's provided with energy. In other words, when you use it. If the Buddha nature is ignored, then it is dormant. Then it's deprived of energy, which means it devolves, it degenerates, or it remains hidden, latent, lost. The energies that we receive, stellar influences, energetic influences, are all harnessed by our psyche and by our physiology in accordance with our actions. So as we behave, we use those energies, we transform them. This is the issue. As we are now, stumbling through life, asleep, daydreaming, fascinated, fantasizing, identified, driven by pride, by fear, by anger. We take and transform those energies and forces into the ego, into desire, and we use them in accordance with desire. And thus, the sleeping state is fortified. Now, how many times in the few minutes that we've been talking have you lost the thread of continuity of what I'm saying and become distracted by your own thoughts or memories? Be honest with yourself. Because those moments of being distracted, of going off into your own psychological country, are exactly what you have to see about yourself in order to understand what gnosis is. If you avoid the recognition of your own sleepy state, you can never awaken. The only one who can awaken is the one who recognizes he is asleep. Because if you think you're awake, then why would you try to change? The energies that are received and processed within us from moment to moment need to be managed, need to be made conscious. So we do that by learning how to observe, how to become aware, how to harness the force of the Buddha nature, or the consciousness, the essence. In other words, we need to learn how to pay attention. We need to remember ourselves. And this is not something that we're going to get like that. It takes a lot of effort and self-analysis and trying from moment to moment. We awaken when we realize we're sleeping. And to realize you're sleeping requires that you awaken. It's sort of a catch-22. There's no easy answer. There's no magic pill. There is only the raw, super effort to maintain a constant state of watchfulness. So we begin by trying to analyze how we sleep, noticing how we sleep, trying to maintain continual consciousness of ourselves. One way to do that is to start to analyze all the impressions that we receive, both internal and external. And to begin to question not only how those impressions arrive to us, but how we react to them. There is an exercise that we study in this teaching called the Key of Soul, or S-O-L. And of course, in Latin languages, soul is related to the sun. And since this is a solar teaching, that of course has significance. But really, each of these letters stands for a component of this practice. They stand for subject, object, location. The first one, subject, invites us to pay close attention to any given phenomenon, to any given impression, to whatever appears before us, to become aware. Object is similar. To look at the objects, to look deeper into the appearances that are stimulated and arising. And location is to question where we are. For example, suddenly I become aware that I'm not paying attention. Immediately, I should initiate this practice. Subject. Well, in one level, I am the subject. So I need to become aware of myself. To remember that I am a consciousness within a physical body. And I need to look at all of the phenomena that appear before me. To look at them as if I've never seen them before. To look at them with a sense of questioning what I see. And further, I should question where I am and why I'm here. What you may notice in this exercise, if you use it, is that it promotes a division of attention. It helps us to develop a very important quality of the consciousness, to strengthen a quality of the consciousness that's necessary for us to grow. And this is the distinction between observer and observed. The practice of SOL can be given a variety of explanations and can be given a variety of interpretations. Because in itself, it's a tool to activate the consciousness. So, you may hear and read not only how the Master Samael explained the practice a little bit differently at different times, but how varying instructors also explain it a little bit differently. The point of it, though, is consistent. Wake up. Pay attention. Notice where you are and what you're doing. Pay close attention in the moment. And what's being pointed at and indicated is to develop the difference, the distinction, the understanding of the observer and the observed. To notice that there is a distinction. To learn to have a sense of inner separation. Fascination, identification, daydreaming happens because we forget ourselves. We become absorbed in dreams, in fantasies. This practice helps us to separate from dreaming and to move our center of gravity into the consciousness to become more aware, more consistently attentive and awake. Now, the third aspect of that SOL is location, in which we ask where we are. Where am I? This has implications and importance beyond first appearance. When we question where we are, we need to truly look at our environment as if we've never seen it before. As if we've never been there. And pay close attention to the details. This is not just an exercise, which is something interesting. What you're doing in this practice is training your consciousness to work. You remember when you were a child, everything was new. Every experience had some kind of vitality. A living, breathing quality which becomes lost as we incorporate more and more of our ego. The practice of SOL helps recover that capacity of the consciousness to see things as they are new. So when we ask, where are we and what are we seeing, we're training the consciousness to do that. If we persist doing this practice all the time, moment to moment, all day, not mechanically, not just saying, okay, where am I? What am I seeing? What am I looking at? That doesn't work. It has to be sincere. It has to be genuine. It has to be very attentive. If you do that all day, the consciousness starts to do it on its own. In the same way you train yourself to walk, in the same way you train yourself to write, you train the consciousness to pay attention. But beautifully, magically, Your consciousness will start to do it at night. And you will start to do it while your physical body is asleep. And you will awaken in a dream, questioning where you are and what you're seeing. And you will become conscious of the dream. This is the unique gift that the influence of Gemini is stimulating in humanity right now. Gemini, of course, is in the house of Mercury, which is an air sign. The intelligences of Mercury, all the hierarchies related to that ray, are in these moments providing energy and guidance and assistance to this humanity to awaken consciousness. And specifically to awaken consciousness in the world of Hod, in the astral plane. This is a beautiful opportunity that we all have to take advantage of those forces. But we have to work to receive it. Nothing is given for free. We have to earn that gift. So although in the many teachings that we study in Gnosis, the many books, there are literally hundreds of practices, many of which are concerned with developing the capacity to awaken the consciousness in the astral plane. Such an experience does not arise mechanically. It does not arise by chance. It arises because of causes and because of conditions. We have to produce the causes and conditions to awaken the consciousness. If you want to awaken your consciousness in the astral plane, in the mental plane, the causal, the buddhic, the atmic, and beyond, you have to awaken here first. We have the consciousness within. We have to awaken the consciousness now. Not tomorrow. But in this moment. To make it active. To make it function the way it should. To take advantage of all the assistance that's coming from our own being and from all the compassionate gods, the angels, the Buddhas, all those intelligences which are providing their assistance. But all of that help is wasted if we do not use our consciousness from moment to moment. As we are now, we slip in and out of the dream state during the day, all day long. Some of us sleep all day long. We never even have a moment of attentiveness or awareness. And this level of sleep is characterized by constantly moving from one worry to another, from one fantasy to another, one memory to another, to a dream, to a desire, to a hope. We're never really here. We're never really in our body, experiencing what it's like to be in the body and to receive consciously the impressions of life. We rarely have that experience as adults. As children, we have it. But as the ego incorporates, that experience becomes less common until eventually we are in a state of sleep all the time. There is a good measure that you can apply to yourself to gauge your own conscious development. But you're not going to like it. I'll tell you what it is, but I'll tell you now, you won't like it. What happens when you go to sleep at night? What happens when you take a nap? Do you completely lose consciousness of yourself? Do you awaken from your sleep a little while later with either no memory at all of what happened since you went to sleep, or some vague, vaporous, obscure image which probably will vanish within a few minutes? Understand that the consciousness is eternal. The consciousness does not die. It's energy. And Einstein himself pointed out, you cannot destroy energy. You can transform it, but you cannot destroy it. The energy of the consciousness does not die. The being, God, within, does not die. But he's also not born. He extends a part of himself, the consciousness, into matter. And that part of himself is the essence, the Burata, which is within us. When we sleep physically and dream, the consciousness is there, but it's asleep. It's buried in that pile of filth. When we have no conscious awareness in the time when our physical body is sleeping, then in the same way, exactly the same, will we experience death. There's only one little difference between your sleep at night and the death of your physical body. And that difference is the connection between your consciousness and that body is cut. Otherwise, sleep is death. That's why in Greek, sleep and death are brothers in the Greek mythology. This is why dream yoga is so important. This is why the hierarchies of Mercury, working through Gemini, are teaching humanity how to awaken consciousness out of the body. How to utilize the watchful, attentive state while dreaming. What we call dreaming. But actually, the goal is to not dream, but to be awake while in the body and out of the body. Samael Aun Weor stated very explicitly, the awakened person no longer dreams. Now you may say, well, I don't remember any dreams. That doesn't mean you're awake. It means you're deeply asleep. First, you have to become aware of your dreams, to come to know them, to discover where they come from, what's producing them. And then we have to eliminate those causes. When all those causes are eliminated, you're awakened. You are a Buddha. You have reached enlightenment. Enlighten, to have light. So we begin physically here, while we're in the body, training the consciousness to be awake, to pay attention from moment to moment, questioning everything that we perceive, both internal and external. Samael Aun Weor put this in terms of observer and observed. To become aware that the consciousness in us is the observer, that which pays attention. This must be made active. To actively pay attention, which means you may know that you're sitting down right now. That doesn't mean that you're paying attention to it. That doesn't mean that you're watching it. You may know that you have eyes, but that doesn't mean that you're watching your eyes, that you're aware that you're receiving impressions through your eyes. You may know that you can hear, but that doesn't mean that you're observing how the sound enters in to your ears and how that sound is translated. So watchfulness is very active, very attentive, and you may start to feel tired. You may start to feel exhausted trying to be attentive. Actually, that's a good sign. The reason is our consciousness is very weak. We haven't used it. It's really like a little baby. The consciousness that we have is not grown the way we live now, the way we're educated now. We have to consciously grow and develop the consciousness, the essence. But as it is in us, it's like a little baby. It has no coordination. It has very little energy. It's very small and fragile. It becomes tired easily. It cries. It has a lot of longings. It needs food. It needs nourishment. It needs love. And our own Buddha nature is the same. But unfortunately, because of our own wrong actions, we have trapped that Buddha nature within a pile of filth, which is our ego. Which is, incidentally, that running commentary that you hear in your mind right now. That running commentary is not the consciousness. That is your mind, which traps the consciousness. The chatter that's always processing is not the consciousness. It's chatter, which are the voices of the ego. Sometimes it sounds good, sometimes it sounds bad, sometimes it's neutral. But don't mistake that chattering voice for the consciousness. It's not. By training the consciousness to be attentive and aware, we have to fight from moment to moment. The fight is learning how to discriminate phenomena. To realize, firstly, this distinction between observer and observed. To know the difference. The consciousness observes phenomenon. But you have to see that in yourself, to feel it, to discover, where is the consciousness in me? What is that? And while you are aware of that, to also be aware of what's outside of that consciousness. Now the observed, so we know, okay, the observer is the essence itself. But we also have to observe it. Do you understand that? We have to observe the observer. There's a division of attention that has to occur, and this is exhausting. These are muscles that we have to develop. Very difficult to strengthen. We strengthen these muscles by constantly observing the observer and by meditating. Meditation is the main exercise, the main practice that we use to develop the consciousness. Meditation is the practice where we first learn to concentrate, we next learn to imagine, and third, we learn to comprehend. That series of steps gives us more strength to observe ourselves. Similarly, when we observe ourselves during the day, we develop more capacity to meditate. This is why we say self-observation and meditation are really the same thing, in the sense that they are both an activity of conscious attention, directed by will. This does not mean that you should only observe yourself during the day and not meditate. You need both. When you observe yourself during the day, you're learning to use the consciousness in the midst of the battlefield of life, while all the different impressions are arising, both external and internal. We need that skill. We also need the skill of using the consciousness when it's isolated, when all those impressions are not arising. We can enter into silence. So we have to have both. The observed is all phenomenon. That includes the essence itself. It includes our physical body. It includes our three brains. It includes our mind. It includes the external world. Is this appearing to be a challenge now? In synthesis, the Gnostic student has to teach themselves to simultaneously observe everything. Everything. Not only all the impressions that are coming from outside, but all the ones that are arising inside, and how we perceive them. That entire series, that entire collection has to be maintained continually within our field of perception, consciously. Now, as we are now, this is extremely difficult. And you might say it's impossible, but it's not. In fact, it's required. And no one can teach you how to do it. No one can do it for you. You can get indications. You can get assistance. You can get clues. But you have to teach yourself. You can't rely on anything or anyone other than your own consciousness. This is why the Buddha said, I cannot save anyone. I cannot make anyone a Buddha. You have to do it yourself. Now, the assistance that you can get comes from Christ. And Christ is that compassionate energy, not a person, that force which is given unto us within. But it has to be born in us. So we begin by studying the teachings, studying ourselves, learning how to use the consciousness. When you establish even a small percentage of being able to perceive observer and observed, consciously, attentively, this is where you can really start to understand the mind. Not understanding it in terms of the intellect. And not understanding it in terms of being able to label it. Any one of us can be aware of a discursive emotion or discursive thought or an afflictive feeling like anger. And we can all feel anger and say, oh, that's my anger. This is not comprehension. Neither is it awareness. Neither is it watchfulness. That's a label. To awaken the consciousness, to utilize the consciousness, is to observe. When you have a feeling, you have to watch that feeling. You have to observe that feeling. The beginning student, even some advanced students, can easily make the mistake of judging a feeling and repressing it. So we may hear, well, anger's no good. So as soon as we feel the arising of anger, we repress it. We avoid it. This is a mistake. There is a sort of balancing act that we have to learn, which is the ability to watch and observe what arises, but also not repress it. So we neither act on it or avoid it. Now, this is in stark contrast to how our mind functions mechanically. This axis of Gemini, one of the dualities that it can stimulate in its negative aspect is the pendulum of the desires of the mind. When we're not in this kind of study, when we're just acting like a normal person, an impression strikes the consciousness, strikes the mind, and we react. That reaction occurs across a range. If you imagine a horizontal line, there's a whole range of qualities here. On one side, far out to the side, is all the qualities related to aversion, something that we want to avoid. And on the far opposite end of that line are all those qualities that we crave, that we desire, that we want. And in the middle are things that we're kind of indifferent to. So we have this range of qualities. We see a given person on the street, and that impression enters into us. When we're not paying attention, that impression stimulates some part of the mind that happens to be there. So we may feel aversion to that person, we may feel craving for that person, we may feel indifferent. None of those are conscious. These are mechanical reactions stimulated in the mind. And this is happening all day long. But in each reaction, wherever it occurs along that line, is a transformation of energy. The energies that are arising in us, that are arriving, are transformed and assimilated according to the reaction produced by the mind. If we see a person and we feel lust for that person, that energy of the impression, combined with the energies in ourselves, feed that lust and stimulate it, making it stronger. If we feel envy, like we want what they have, then we stimulate that envy. We feed it and strengthen it. If we feel pride, we feel better than that person, then we stimulate and feed that pride. This is how we are normally. We would say abnormally. But constantly throughout the day and throughout the night. As we sleep and as we experience impressions, all those energies are being transformed and assimilated by the ego. This is an influence related to Mercury, related to the mind, related to Gemini. It's this duality of the pendulum which is occurring in us right now. The solution is to pay attention, to become aware of the impressions that are entering into the senses, to observe them. Now, if we're walking down the street again, and we see some person, and we feel aversion, let's say we see somebody that we feel is inferior to us, we have to observe that. We have to analyze that. Don't avoid it. Don't repress it. Don't act on it either. Remain indifferent. Remain watchful. Observe the feelings. This is the first stage. To remain aware. Simply watching. Then, later, do the same in meditation. Later in the day, you sit, you relax, you close your eyes, and you review the varying events in the day that strike you as important, things that you need to understand. All you need to do is observe them. You replay the scene and watch it in your mind. But notice something important. Your mind will try to change it. Your mind will try to alter the memory, to try and change it to support the ego. There are a lot of subtle things that happen. And the development of attentiveness is key to stop making mistakes. In that process, both in day-to-day, moment-to-moment experiences and in meditation, what you're seeking, remember, is to enter the third state of consciousness, which is self-remembering, which is a state of profound conscious attention combined with the remembrance of God. In other words, in that experience of seeing a person on the street that we feel is inferior to us, if we remember God, we remember our own being, how can we feel pride? How can we feel superior to that other person who also has God within, who also has a being? Similarly, if we see another person on the street and we feel lust, desire, craving for that person, if we remember God, we will feel remorse. We will then recognize that that other person is a child of God, the same as us. We may, for example, see this lustful person, a person that we feel lust for, rather. And by remembering God in that moment, by observing ourselves and seeing that lust for what it is, we can realize that that lust is a desire for an image, for a sensation, which is ephemeral, which is impermanent, which is an illusion. In all the experiences of life, by learning how to use the third state of consciousness to be in self-observation and self-remembering, we are starting to work with the Tao. The Tao is the third state. And that is a state of profound attentiveness, where we learn to pay attention to everything as it is, not trying to change impressions, but to comprehend them. Now you'll see here that this Tao, or third state, transcends the duality of the mind. To be in the third state of consciousness transcends craving and aversion. In fact, it transcends evolution and devolution. It is beyond birth and death. It is. And this is why they say the Tao is, was, and always will be. It is a state of absolute existence. Through the third state of consciousness, remember, we enter that door up the vertical path, the levels of being. So maybe this is a little subtle, but the point is, when we learn to consciously manage the dualities of life, all the dual forces of nature within ourselves, we transcend those dualities. Another example is in man and woman. Gemini, of course, is typically seen as the twins, and normally depicted as two men. But actually that symbol has many levels of meaning. The two columns of Gemini can represent the two columns of the temple. The two souls of Atman, which are Buddhi and Manas, or in other words, the spiritual soul and the human soul. Those two pillars can also represent the astral body and the mental body. They can also represent ourselves and our double, which is one of the great occult mysteries. It can also represent ourselves and our astral body. There are many doubles, there are many twins, there are many pairs. But in every case, the development of a consciousness occurs when the pairs are equilibrated. They're balanced. We see this also, of course, in studying the nature of Da'at. Da'at is the tree of knowledge, of good and bad. Or in other words, two factors that polarize, that oppose each other. But the science of Da'at is the way to equilibrate those two forces. And when they are in equilibrium, there is a third formed, which is that third force. Similarly, we have in ourselves the mind and the heart, the intellect and the heart. The natives of Gemini, because this is an air sign related to Mercury, receive a strong push or influence related to the mind. So they tend to be somewhat intellectual. Or rather, they try to solve everything with their head, which creates a lot of problems for Gemini people. What they need to learn is to balance the mind with the heart, to learn to feel with the head, and to think with the heart. Truly, all of us need to learn that. But it's particularly true of the Gemini native. The balance of heart and mind cannot occur so long as a third force is absent. Do you know what the third force is? The consciousness. This is why we see many students of religions, students of gnosis, who fight and are always in conflict between the feelings they have and the thoughts they have, the ideas they have. There's always a fight in them. They feel drawn towards gnosis, but conflicted in their theories and ideas about it. And this conflict is happening in them because they are not awakening the consciousness. They're not learning how to pay attention. They're not learning how to meditate. The mind and heart are brought into equilibrium when the consciousness is developed. And then these two, heart and mind, are naturally equilibrated. Those three are strengthened and fed and fortified through transmutation. So you may encounter students who have this conflict. They may be transmuting their energies. They may be studying gnosis. They may have a lot of good ideas about gnosis. They may seem very sincere emotionally, but they're always in conflict. They're always fighting within themselves and with others. Fighting outside, fighting with ideas, fighting with theories. For example, there are students who may be studying for years who nonetheless remain deeply conflicted about these studies. Perhaps they are deeply conflicted about meditation, not understanding what meditation is or how to meditate. This is a very painful experience. And the issue arises simply because that person is placing too much importance either in the heart or the mind. In reality, they have to be balanced within the context of the consciousness. And this is not something that anybody can teach them, and it's not something that anybody can do for them. Each of us has to arrive at that understanding on our own. And it's painful. It's difficult. This is why we always emphasize repeatedly to meditate, to practice. Notice and observe in yourself how willing you are to spend an hour a day or 2 hours a day watching television, but you're not willing to meditate. How resistant you feel to practicing meditation. But you're very willing and excited to watch TV. Or to watch movies, or to gossip, or to read magazines. Why? What creates that? What are you feeding with your behaviors? What are you fortifying with your behaviors? The Indian tantric master Padmasambhava, who brought Tantrism to India, taught something very similar to the master Samael Aun Weor. When we study this practice of SOL, we're learning how to separate the consciousness and observe. And in this very potent and long-held secret tantric scripture, we read these words from the Indian master. You should observe that which naturally arises and naturally originates within your own mind. First, observe the source from which these appearances initially originate. Second, observe the place in which they abide in the interim. Third, observe the place to which they will finally go. Then one will find that just as, for example, a pond-dwelling crow does not stray from its pond, even though it flies away from the pond, similarly, although appearances arise from the mind, they arise from the mind and subside into the mind of their own accord. The practice of SOL, in its refined development, in its refined practice, leads the consciousness to understand that all appearances are produced by the mind. If you have a struggle or a conflict with meditation, it is not the fault of your instructor. It is not the fault of your school. It is not the fault of the day and age in which you live. It is arising from your own mind. If you have a desire to watch television, it is arising from within your own mind. If you have a conflict with your boss, with your friend, it is arising within your own mind. The development of the attention and consciousness should lead you to that comprehension. To never blame. To never assign responsibility outside. To comprehend that right view perceives the inherent nature of all things as being empty and impermanent. Thereby, we can reduce our own suffering and begin to act in the right way. So, what we need to do in synthesis is to learn how to awaken consciousness right now, in this moment. To become aware of that conflict within ourselves between craving and aversion, and to observe that. To notice how we have, let's say we have a craving to have experiences in the astral plane. We have a desire for that. But is it a desire of ego, or is it a longing of consciousness? Only you can know. I give you one more little clue about the consciousness that we have within. Because really, unless you grasp this, gnosis will always remain a mystery to you. The consciousness is what we have to develop. To develop that, you have to know what it is. You have to be able to find it in yourself and to work with it. The Maitreya Buddha said, let me read the quote so I don't miss something. If the Buddha nature were not present, there would be no remorse over suffering. There would be no longing for nirvana, nor striving and devotion towards this aim. The longing to know God, the longing to experience the truth, is a longing of the consciousness, is a longing of the Buddha nature, the essence. We can create problems for ourselves when we complicate that longing by becoming too intellectual or by becoming fanatical, emotional. The longing that the consciousness has, the buddhata, has to be fed with practical experience. The urge that the student feels to study gnosis, to consume it, to stuff oneself with all the books and lectures and everything, can create a complication. We need to study. We need to read. But we must practice. Study without practice creates suffering. If you don't believe me, look around at students who study but do not practice. This is one way that we need to balance heart and mind with the consciousness. The heart has that longing to know what gnosis is, to know what nirvana means, to know what God is, to experience the astral plane, to experience talking with an angel or a God. That longing is part of the buddhata, which longs to reunite with God. And there's a longing also of the buddhata which comes through the mind. The longing to understand. To understand why life is the way it is. To understand the laws that manage the planets and suns. Why we have a physical body. Why do we die? But if we just stimulate those longing qualities in the heart and mind, and we do not practice, we will remain outside of the door of gnosis. The Gemini native can suffer from this particularly because they can become overly intellectual or fanatical. They have this dual aspect. And again, the answer is meditate. Practice. Learn how to be attentive. Learn how to be aware. In a sense, it means we have to become a spy of our own selves. To always be watching our own selves. There are a number of practices that we study in this teaching. Of course, today we've talked extensively about self-observation and self-remembering. And there are numerous practices that we can begin to study to develop our own skills with meditation. But in relation to Gemini, the focus is particularly related to becoming conscious of the dream state. Of course, that begins physically. To stop dreaming physically. To be attentive. To be aware. But we also need to learn to become conscious as we transition between the first two states of consciousness. In other words, when the physical body is going to sleep, we have to become conscious of that. Any person can develop the ability to remain conscious while the physical body goes to sleep. And you do it by making the effort to do so. So tonight, when you're ready to sleep, you can lie down and pray from your heart and ask your own inner being, your own God, your own Divine Mother, for help. You can also pray to those intelligences that are related to Gemini and Mercury to help you. There's a mantra you can use if you want to chant aloud the mantra Rusti, R-U-S-T-I, and extend the vowels. Rusti. If you have other people present, you can do it silently in your mind. But it's not enough to just repeat a mantra. You have to be attentive. You have to be watchful. You have to utilize the consciousness. It's not enough just to lie there and start making noises. If you don't utilize your consciousness, you cannot awaken it. The consciousness does not awaken by any mechanical means. There's no drug. There's no trick. There's no shortcut. The mantras help. They draw and focus energy. They stimulate psychic centers. They can open doors. But to walk through the door, you have to be awake. There is no accident here. There's conscious will. Now, the real challenge becomes learning how to do that without desire. If you're lying in your bed and you're starting to do the mantra, but you feel a lot of desire to have this kind of experience, you probably won't. Because that desire may well be egotistical. Similarly, if you feel a lot of fear, it won't happen. Because fear is a desire. It's just aversion. Through practical experience, we can affirm to you that the one who learns to enter at will into the astral plane is the one who knows how to be in equanimity within the heart and mind. To be in equanimity means to have neither craving nor aversion. To be at peace. Now, Gemini is the symbol of those two columns, whose power is the power of association or fraternity, harmony. So we've already talked about the harmony of heart and mind. This harmony is an equilibration or balance or equanimity. Gemini, those forces through the influence of Gemini can assist us in our understanding and development of equanimity. So when you try this practice, if you feel fear, just reflect. Every night when you go to sleep, you go to the astral plane. You just don't know it. That's what you should be afraid of. Is you're going into realms without consciousness of it. What you're trying to do now is become conscious of it and to take control. If you feel desire or longing that's very strong, reflect in a similar way. Why should I feel desire for something that's natural? If God wants me to have this, He will give it. Have peace. Have acceptance. And the experiences will unfold naturally. Do you have any questions? Yes.
What is the next realm after the astral plane?
Well, the astral plane, to answer that question, requires a little subtlety. Well, maybe I'll ask you instead. What do you mean?
Is there in sleep a higher realm that you can enter into?
Yes, there are many levels, many realms. Another useful way to look at this is in terms of dimensions. This physical world, we call it the third dimension. And that's because we here perceive length, width, and height. But there are other dimensions which extend above and below this one. But what you should notice firstly is that even within this physical world, there are many levels, most of which we cannot perceive easily. For example, the very small. You need tools. Or the very large, or the very far away. But the same is true for other dimensions. They also have levels, different aspects. When you're dreaming, when you're outside of a physical body, most of the time you are in what we would call the astral plane, but it's really only one piece of it. It is actually your own mind. It is a self-enclosed little world of your own mind, which is inside the astral plane. In Hebrew terms, we call this the klipot. And it is the unconscious levels of your mind, the subconscious levels of your mind, and the infraconscious levels, which are illustrated in this tree of life by this inferior tree. And there are 9 levels to that. So it goes quite deep. Generally, in our dreams, we're in the first level, which is called limbo. But more disturbing dreams, like nightmares, are in the deeper levels. What's important to point out here is that this is where the majority of our dreams are experienced. Dreams are living experiences. We're just not aware of it. We're just not conscious of it. Some people are. So we always hear about lucid dreaming, or out-of-body experiences, or near-death experiences. These are all really the same phenomena with slight variations. They are experiences of the consciousness of other levels of nature, which exist within us, which also exist outside of us. A dream is an experience of our own mind, which is real. But when we're physically dreaming, we're here projecting our dreams in the mind. So they seem kind of indistinct. When you step outside of your physical body, utilizing what people call the astral body, those experiences seem very real. That's why we usually don't realize we're dreaming, because we think it's real. So you may wake up some morning and say, why was I dreaming of having a long conversation about philosophy with a hedgehog? Because you were dreaming and you thought it was real. Your consciousness was so asleep, fascinated, identified, hypnotized, you didn't realize you're in limbo. Your own psychological limbo. And in that place, we act out all of our dreams, all of our fantasies, all of our desires. We repeat past experiences, and we project our desires and act them out. So if you're angry with a person, you may dream of hurting them. It's a projected desire, but you don't realize it because you're dreaming. The goal is to awaken, because those experiences are real, living experiences with matter and energy. It's just different from physical matter. Nonetheless, cause and effect still applies. Karma still applies. What you do in your dreams has karmic implications. Just because you're dreaming doesn't make you free of the law. It doesn't give you immunity from the consequences of your actions. You still are responsible because those elements are in you and they are acting. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, is what they say. And it's true. So this becomes an urgent necessity because day by day, moment to moment, daydreaming and fantasizing, dreaming, produces karma. Yes?
Can you say more about the mystery of the double?
The double. Well, there's this very strange and mysterious fact that we each have an antithesis. We have a double. We have a mirror opposite. Personally, I don't talk about it much because it seems to me that this can be a cause of great skepticism in a student. And it can stimulate too much fantasy or even worry. But basically, in esoteric traditions, it's understood that we each have sort of a twin or a double, an opposite. So we know, for example, that the Buddha Shakyamuni had his brother, who's called Devadatta, who's called the king of hell. But he's really just the double or the opposite of the Buddha. So in occultism, it's understood that each of us has a double. And I believe I've heard that spoken of in some folk traditions as well. Some of the indigenous cultures also talk about that. And I've even heard it said that if you meet your double, you can't handle it. You'll die. I don't know if that's a true thing or just an indigenous myth, but it's something I've heard before. So it's just, I'm only pointing that out to say this is something that has come up from time and again throughout history. Any other questions?
So you don't think it's a good practice to, for argument's sake, say daily chores, washing dishes, right? Activating the mind just to concentrate on that one particular, item or whatever, say the dish or the water or this, so other thoughts don't enter your mind, so you don't fantasize. So you're still trying to keep your consciousness awake, if that's consciousness.
Okay, that's a very good question. I think to understand the answer to that question requires two things, both a little subtlety of thought or intuition, and also some practical experience. First and foremost, whatever we do, we should do only that. This is so important. It's hard to fully convey the importance of doing what you're doing without distraction. And the reason behind it will be understood when you do it. But typically, when we do any given thing, let's say we're washing the dishes. Normally we wash the dishes, but we're thinking about other things. We're thinking about the bills. We're thinking about work. Same is true when we're going to sleep at night. We're not just there to go to sleep. We're thinking about tomorrow. We're thinking about what happened today, etc. The whole point of our studies is to gain conscious control over our mind. However, you cannot force the mind. You can only silence the mind naturally. It will silence on its own. Now this is why I say it requires a little intuition and a little practice. Because when you learn to pay attention, to consciously direct attention, what you're learning to utilize is the consciousness, not the mind. But we confuse that. Typically, we think the mind is the consciousness. And this is where the problem begins for many students. In other words, in the Dzogchen tradition, for example, they state this very well. One instructor, one master from the Dzogchen tradition in Tibet said, whatever thoughts arise, observe them. And if thoughts don't arise, observe. Whether this or that, remain the same, observing. Same is true when you're doing the dishes. You do the dishes. You just do your action, whether thoughts come or not. Do you see the subtle difference? It's a matter of how you pay attention. Normally, we get so kind of indoctrinated with this idea we must silence the mind that we take a sort of violent approach, which does not work. It actually creates more problems, which become very difficult to unravel. So right from the beginning, do not gag the mind. Do not force your mind to be silent. Firstly, it's impossible to do it. Now, you might force and gain the impression that it's becoming silent, but that is a lie, it's an illusion. The deeper levels are even worse conditioned than they were before, because you're forcing something, you're repressing. And that can become very difficult. Instead, focus on learning to pay attention, no matter what happens, no matter what's arising, no matter what's passing away. So as you're doing the dishes, for example, you pay attention. I'm washing the dish. You don't have to think anything. Right? You're just watching yourself do it. And then you see and you notice some thoughts arising. Remember the quote I read from Padmasambhava? He says, notice where the thoughts come from. You just observe. Here comes this thought about John and his problem and this and that. You notice it. You observe how the thought kind of hangs in your mind for a little while, and then it goes away. But all the while, you remain consciously attentive. Normally what happens is, the thought arises, and we become identified with it. We start to think that thought. We start to feel what that thought stimulates. We start to feed it and follow it. Oh, well, maybe I should do this, and maybe I should go here. Maybe I should talk to so-and-so. We become identified. We go to sleep. And after a moment or two, we're not even aware of what we're doing, washing the dish. We're actually imagining John and the thing that happened and what we need to say and do. We're asleep. We're dreaming. The Master Samael Aun said, it only takes an instant of forgetfulness to begin dreaming. Like that. We're dreaming.
So you can say about an argument between two people or more, the mind of the other people getting identified with it?
Yeah. It's easy for us to become identified. Even by external things that we observe, we can become involved and identified in our own mind. There are many examples that the Master gives in his books. But I think it's most useful to look into our own lives and discover what are the things that cause us to lose awareness of ourselves. We have to become mature, consciously speaking. And that maturity arises when we begin to recognize our own behaviors and how we choose what we do. Why do we choose to do the things that we do? We become very quickly absorbed into things that were not our original intention. And so an example given is we may see two people arguing, which doesn't concern us, but we can become involved because we become identified one way or the other with what they're going through. In that way, we can bring on a lot of suffering onto ourselves that's not necessary, and we can cause others to suffer too. There are innumerable examples of how we sleep. But the point is, we have to learn how to do one thing at a time and pay attention to that. To question. When something is stimulating us to act, we have to question that. Where is that stimulation coming from? Where is that impulse coming from? Is it conscious? Or is it mechanical? This is not an easy battle, and it's not a short one. So each day, each moment, we have to observe and pay attention, not to gag the mind, not to reject what's arising, but to observe it. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I'll give you another sample. Then almost it's like I can't really give my opinion about something also.
Excellent.
No, but why? See, I'll just say watching a reality show, okay? And singer comes up, and it's bad. My taste of music to it, I don't like it. Say, my emotional center starts, working, blah, blah, blah. Is something wrong? Is there something wrong with that?
Well, you have to discover that for yourself in the nature of each experience. But it's very important that you question it in the way that you're doing. With each experience that arises, with each impression that you are observing, you have to question your reactions. You have to question your impulse to say something. And discover, here I am getting stimulated by this impression of the music or the singer. And I have this phrase that's bubbling up that I want to say. But why do I want to say it? Is it to benefit someone else? Is it my pride? Is it my anger? Is it sarcasm? Is it something conscious or not? So it means, in a sense, we have to become more passive as a personality and more active as a consciousness. Unfortunately, we're so mechanical that we say things without knowing why we say them. And much of what we say, we're just repeating someone else's opinion. This is a curious thing about people in these times. People will repeat the opinion of someone else and then fight to protect it as if it were their own. And often they don't even know why they believe it or say it. There's no real conscious comprehension of that opinion or that idea or that statement.
When you say it's passive, but then you're labeling it also, aren't you, in that sense?
No. The personality being passive is a state of activity. When your personality is active, that means the face, the mask, the persona that you use to interact with others is very active. So the qualities of your upbringing, of your training, of your form of speech, of the kind of cultural influences that you have become very active. So, for example, music. You may be observing a singer or music, hearing it, and don't like it. But that may just be your personality. It may just be a part of your personality that does not like that kind of music. It has no reflection on the conscious value of the music. So if you were raised in Latin America, you have the cultural value, the personality, which appreciates and enjoys Latin American music. But if you hear music from China, you may say, yuck, and not like it. But that doesn't mean that's a conscious reaction. It's a reaction in the personality. Where a person who's conscious and attentive and aware may be able to perceive the conscious values of that music and learn to appreciate it, if there are any conscious values in it. You follow me?
But it's still almost like dislike and like, you know. You're still...
Well, the bottom line is, the consciousness is. Like and dislike are reactions of the mind. Craving and aversion, like and dislike. Yes?
So when you catch yourself in one of these traps, when you catch yourself by or in some sort of state of fascination, not doing what you're doing, or avoiding or craving something, you don't want to repress it. You do want to observe it. But if it's something that you see as being like negative, or you don't want to identify, you don't want to be caught in this state of fascination, do you just play it out, but just like watch it, or what? It just seems like I don't know how do I handle it? It seems like you can't do anything.
It's hard not to use the mind. It's so...
The point of this process is to develop the capacity to act from intuition. Intuitive action is what leads us to awaken the consciousness. And intuitive action is free of duality, good and bad, yes and no. To act intuitively requires that you are able to hear intuition and to recognize it. So you have to have some discrimination. And we all have that so long as we have some degree of free consciousness incarnated. And the first sign, which I mentioned, is we should have a quality of remorse when we do something wrong. Right there, you know, if you're doing something and you become aware of yourself and you feel a quality of remorse, stop. Stop it. That does not mean repress what's processing in your three brains. It means cease that action and observe yourself. For example, you may find yourself in a heated argument, and then you become aware of it. You should be quiet. You should stop talking, which means to cease the action. But observe the anger. Notice how it feels, because anger is a state of suffering. It's very painful. So you should be observing that. To repress it means you would avoid it. You would get away from the situation, maybe avoid the person, or you'd try to cover it up by saying, oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Let's get some ice cream and let's go hang out, whatever. Wrong. You need to observe. You need to comprehend. Now, there are cases where it's necessary for us to Replace that inferior emotion with a superior one. Because sometimes, for example, that anger may be so strong we cannot control it. In that case, it's good to take a walk, to get an ice cream, to not think. This is not repression. This is a subtle thing. It's not repression. You're not avoiding it within yourself. You're calling in a superior quality. Maybe listen to some relaxing music, go work in your garden, do something nice for a little while, and just until that heat calms down a little bit enough so you can control it. Then you should meditate. Then you should start to reflect on that event and analyze it. Don't leave it alone. Don't walk away from it. Because if you do, it will remain there, unsolved, and probably getting worse, festering inside. So this work requires a great deal of delicacy and a great deal of caution. And each situation is going to require a little bit different management. And that's something only you can define. It's intuitive. Your being can guide you. But you have to listen to that quality of intuition, yes and no. What do I really need to do here? Feel that. Don't rationalize about it. Don't reason about it. Trust the sense about it that your being can give you. And remain with this quality of watchfulness. In the beginning, it takes so much effort, so much caution to learn this. And later, it requires even more. Because you start to deal with even more subtle egos, which can feel like intuition, but which are not. So it's not going to get any easier in that way. Does that answer your question? Sort of? Yeah. It's something that you'll have to experience, like everything else. Become aware of yourself. Feel what is right. Feel what is wrong. Your own consciousness can tell you that if you listen to it. And it'll tell you through hunches, through just a sense. You may not know why. You may not have a good reason. But you'll sense it if you listen. And that takes the ability to trust your intuition, to trust your consciousness. And oftentimes, it will seem to contradict what your mind tells you. So you'll probably encounter in yourself and in other students people who have a conflict saying, well, I feel like this is right, but I think it's wrong. Very common. Again, the mind and heart battling. And the equilibration happens by meditating through the consciousness. More questions?
I mean, in my case, I guess sports is not even an option then.
Why not?
Well, watching sports, like, you have your favorite team, and you're rooting for your favorite team. I mean,
you can watch sports. Let me tell you something. Gnosis is not about abandoning or changing your physical habits. It's about understanding them and making better choices. You can watch sports, but watch them consciously. You see? Because the reason I'm putting it that way is, if you have a great love of sports, if sports has been a part of your life, that means that a great portion of your mind is wrapped up in that. And if you avoid sports, you won't comprehend that part of yourself. You won't understand it. You'll be avoiding it. So watch it. But watch it consciously and watch yourself until you can really comprehend and understand it. You may find, in the end, that you can watch the sports and not be identified, but enjoy it. You may find you don't need it anymore. It depends. It depends on your own development. So similar qualities can happen with music. We all talk about how classical music is helpful, right? It's good. But many people are identified with it. And it's a very egotistical thing for them, which is harmful. So it doesn't mean they should stop listening to it. It means they need to just listen to it consciously and learn to discriminate and differentiate. Gnosis is in the experience of each moment. We have to transform our experience of each moment. You won't find Gnosis by avoiding things. You find it by transforming them. So here's another simple example. The master I was reading from earlier, Padmasambhava, was a great tantric master who had profound wisdom related to all the varying arts and sciences of Gnosis. In certain stages of his development, he would meditate in cremation grounds. Now, most of us would say, not only is that foul, it's unhealthy. You know, why would you go to a cremation ground? There's so much filth there and the potential for disease and all these. Just our whole being will reject that idea, right? Our whole sense of self. But for him, there were conscious values that he was able to develop through that experience. So the point is, we need to look to transform our life as it is now. Now, certain kinds of behaviors we obviously need to stop. Fornication, obviously. We shouldn't kill anybody. We shouldn't do things that are harmful. I mean, that's clear. So from that point of view, then we start to say, okay, what other activities that I'm engaged in now are harmful? Should I stop them? And you need to analyze. Maybe you love to read books. It doesn't mean you stop reading books. You can read, but read consciously, and you may find that your tastes change. What about television? That's up to you. Some people need to stop that completely. Some are so identified with it that if they reject it completely, their problems will actually get worse. This is one thing that the master says in fundamental education. If you completely repress a behavior, you don't solve it. You can actually make it worse. You need to comprehend it. So it doesn't mean that you should walk away from a behavior completely. And he says that in the book quite clearly, Fundamental Education, that some students will walk away from certain kinds of behaviors and repress them and ignore them. All that happens is the desire for that experience actually gets stronger. The desire for that behavior. So it doesn't work. Repression does not work. Avoidance does not work. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
To learn more about what you learned in this lecture, we invite you to explore the books published by Glorian Publishing, available from booksellers worldwide. You may also be interested in online courses or upcoming retreats, all of which you can learn about at GnosticTeachings.org. All of this has been made possible by the financial support of listeners like you. Will you help others to benefit from this knowledge? Most spiritual schools recommend a donation of $10 to $20 per lecture. Every donation helps. Make a donation now at GnosticTeachings.org. Thank you. May all beings be happy.